All right, so we're going to move into our next module. In this module, we're going to focus primarily on directory services, and specifically directory services that are integrated in the UC platform. Now, we'll focus primarily on Unified Communications Manager, but LDAP integration can work with Unity Connection. We can do LDAP integration with most of our platforms. And we would typically do that, although Unity Connection can also do local usernames as well as integration through AXL with Unified Communications Manager. So in this module, integrating Cisco Unified Communications Manager, we're going to talk about LDAP as a general protocol. I'll start with kind of introducing the protocol and what its basic function is. And then we're going to take a look at LDAP synchronization for Call Manager. We'll also take a look at LDAP authentication for Call Manager. So that's an interesting concept. You can use LDAP in the context of Call Manager just to synchronize the database, but manage authentication on Call Manager itself. So authentication is actually going to, passwords, PINs, usernames, and so on would be managed on Call Manager, even though we're synchronizing the overall database with the LDAP directory. Or you can use LDAP to do both authentication and, well, synchronization and authentication, which is typically what you're going to do in most modern environments. All right. We'll also talk about LDAP attribute mapping in Call Manager, being able to map the attributes that are specified in the LDAP structure to what Call Manager likes to see, specific attributes for the end users in Call Manager. We'll talk about different LDAP considerations, what are access control groups, what are feature group templates, and then finally we'll wrap up this module by doing Discovery 5, configuring and troubleshooting LDAP integration with Unified Communications Manager. All right, so we're going to talk about LDAP, the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol System, and really kind of all of the components of LDAP and how it fits within the UC environment. So let me pull up this diagram real quick. And I want to kind of mention the section that we're talking about is right here, right? We have this LDAP subsystem that we're configuring within Unified Communication Manager. You can see that we can turn it on or off. We can turn, as a general configuration, we can turn on authentication or turn off authentication. We have LDAP server specifications that we have to define. We have the LDAP directory information that we have to define. And the directory sync service needs to be enabled in order for us. This is a feature service, not a network service. So it is an optional service within Unified Communications Manager that we can enable. Remember, I mentioned that before. When in the context of services on Call Manager, we have feature services and we have network services. Feature services are, as the name implies, additional features that you can enable. Network services are critical services that have to be running in order for the platform to function. Directory sync or DIR sync is the feature service that we use to do the LDAP integration. Obviously, we take that information from our LDAP subsystem, and that allows us to define application users and end users. There is a difference between an end user and an application user. Application users are defined to access the UC applications. So whether it's the Call Manager administration, OS administration, etc., whereas end users get tied to endpoints and devices. So most of the users that you're going to see within the system are going to be defined as end users. We can also see that end users have credential policies that they reference, access control groups, which allow us to define the roles that users can perform, the applications that they can access, the resources they can access, and so on. We're not going to get into those specifics in this section. Our focus in this section is primarily, what is the LDAP protocol, what is directory integration, and how do we perform that integration within the UC architecture. All right. So first, let's start by talking about the protocol in general, right? The lightweight directory access protocol. It's a little bit beyond the scope of the class to kind of go into the specifics of the protocol, but I do want to kind of mention a couple of things about it, right? It is an open, standard, vendor-neutral application protocol. It's a directory information services protocol. Directory services obviously play a very important role in most kind of network-based architectures because we have end users that we need to manage. We have users, we have services, we have applications that we need to manage. And having a centralized repository for all of this information, being able to organize the records in a hierarchical structure makes it a lot easier for us. LDAP as a protocol is a specification of a series of IETF standard publications. There's multiple RFCs. The latest is LDAP version 3, which is RFC 4511, and that kind of defines what LDAP, how LDAP is structured today. It is based on a simple subset of standards that are part of the X.500 standard. And sometimes you might even actually see LDAP referred to as X500 Lite for that particular reason. The LDAP client, in this case the client would be Unified Communications Manager, starts the LDAP session by connecting to the LDAP server. That server in the overall context of authentication is called the Directory System Agent. And that communication is either going to occur on TCP or UDP port 389, or if you're running LDAP-S, which is LDAP over SSL, most likely that's going to be port 636. The client itself, again, in this case, Unified Communications Manager, sends operation requests to the server, and then the server sends the response. The actual request operations we don't really need to get into, but some of the basic operations are bind, to authenticate and identify what LDAP version you're going to use. A search, kind of a basic function in LDAP to find or retrieve specific directory entries, adding entries, deleting entries, modifying entries, things like modifying the distinguished name, and there's some other operations. All right. But as far as the directory structure goes, every entry consists of a set of attributes. The attributes themselves actually have names within the directory structure. And it could be an attribute type, it could be an attribute description, and then we have specific values that are defined for those attribute names, right? And then each entry within the LDAP directory has a unique identifier. And that unique identifier is probably one of the most important components of the LDAP directory. We call that the DN. The DN is the distinguished name. All right. So think of a DN in the context of LDAP as a file path. And then you have this relative distinguished name, which is kind of like the file name itself in the parent folder. So it would be /a/b/c.txt. That would be the DN, if you will. And then c.txt would be the actual RDN. So you might have a DN of John Doe example.com. So the CN information or the container information might be John Doe. The DC information might be example, and then the other DC information might be .com. But other LDAP attributes include things like telephone number, email address, manager information, and then we have a whole bunch of different elements as well. So you're going to see in the context of, especially when we start to configure the filtering and whatnot, you have to understand the basic structure, which is why I'm talking about it now, for LDAP, right? DN is distinguished name. CN is basically the relative distinguished name. DC is a domain component. So you would see DC in reference to something like Cisco.com, for example, or thinKtanklearning.com or whatever. CN is really actually, I called it container before, but it's actually defined specifically as common name. Mail would be like an email address. SN would be like a surname. So you do have to be kind of familiar with that terminology, especially when you're trying to identify what we call the search base when we're defining our LDAP configurations. As far as operations of LDAP, there's an add operation, there's a bind operation, which is the initial authentication. There's a delete operation, there's a search and compare operation, there's a modify operation, there's a modify DN operation, and then there are extended operations which include things like start TLS if I want to establish a TLS session for that LDAP function. And then there's abandon and unbind as well. All right. So you can see from the diagram here, they're obviously looking at this from a more generic standpoint, right? LDAP is our corporate directory, and we can take that information and we can use it for user provisioning within our IP telephony applications. The phones, if you push the directory button on the phone as an example, it can search the LDAP directory to look up users and user information. We can use LDAP to do authentication for IP telephony application administrators. That would be my application users. And then we also have our end users. We can do authentication for our end users. So within the context of call manager, that's really kind of what they're talking about in this particular case. All right. Now we do see in this table here the context of LDAP in the function of UC, right? Directory access means that we're trying to do lookups for our collaboration endpoints. Directory integration means that we're provisioning users in Call Manager. So there's two things you can do with LDAP integration within UC. And one of those things is to simply incorporate the directory so that we can gather or collect the information from the LDAP directory. And the other is to allows us the ability to actually do the authentication. All right. So if I have a requirement to do a lookup for an endpoint, Cisco's solution is directory access, and the Unified Communications Manager feature that provides that functionality is the Unified IP Phone Software Development Kit or the User Data Service, the Cisco User Data Service. For user provisioning, we simply do our LDAP synchronization. And by the way, that's all if that's all you want to do is simply provision users, and you still want to control the authentication of the users and set credentials and whatnot within Call Manager, you don't have to use LDAP for authentication. You can just use LDAP for synchronization. However, if you do want to use authentication, both for end users and application users, then we can configure the LDAP authentication system as well. You guys will be doing this in your discovery, of course, at the end of our discussion for this particular module. All right. Now, it is important to kind of distinguish the difference between the different types of accounts. There are two different types of accounts that exist within the Unified Communications Manager architecture. There's an end user. These are, like I said in the beginning of our discussion, these are the physical people that are basically tied to endpoints. They're not necessarily administrators. They're not managing the UC system. The individual user typically is tied to a device, whether it's a physical phone or a soft phone or a Jabber client, whatever it might be. The application users that we define within Call Manager are the ones that are actually accessing the GUI, the command line, to manage the system, right? So CCM admin or CCM Call Manager, Cisco Call Manager Administration, CUC admin, Unity Connection Administration, these are going to be your application users, all right? Now you can have application users that are end users that require application user access. There are some GUI interfaces that that end users can access, but end users are typically just the individual user. They are part of LDAP. Notice that application users are not part of LDAP. All right, they're not included in the user directory. For example, I wouldn't want somebody to push the directory button on the phone and see all my administrative user accounts on the phone. When you push the directory button on the phone, it is actually pulling that information from the integration of LDAP itself. Okay. All right. End user access in Call Manager is tied to a username and a password. The users themselves are put into groups and they are assigned different roles. We'll get into that in a little more detail later on. And then based on those groups and roles, they can access certain resources within the system. Now, end users can also access Call Manager administration pages if they're given the appropriate role, if they're given the appropriate permissions, right? When we look at user configurations, whether it's an end user or an application user, we assign those users to an access control group. The access control group references a role, and then we have different applications that get assigned to that role, and then within that application you can access resources. You can give no access to that resource, read-only access to that resource, or full update access to that resource. So through the use of roles and groups, we're able to identify what functionality application users and end users have within the system. All right, so that's a pretty important concept as well. Notice on the diagram, Cisco DIR Sync is listed here. That is the service that needs to be enabled in order for us to be able to do this integration with LDAP and so on. All right. Now, if there's an authentication component, the authentication challenge that gets sent is carried inside of HTTP. You can see that on the diagram here. That's going to be relayed by the web service on the Call Manager server to an internal library called the IMS. The IMS is what allows us to authenticate the end users and application users against the database that's in Call Manager. Now, how we populate that database in Call Manager really depends on what our objective is. Are we populating that locally, or are we populating that database with integration to LDAP? So the whole focus of this section here obviously is populating that internal database with the integration of LDAP. There are certain applications. We can see the different applications like Attendant Console, Cisco Compatibility Extension, Cisco Unified CM Assistant that require app authentication. Extension Mobility Login requires a PIN-based authentication. You press the directory button, that's going to allow you to do lookups through the web service and through the IMS into the embedded database within Unified Communications Manager. And then we also have password-based authentication for administration users as well as IP telephony users. So the diagram is a little bit confusing, but it's kind of just identifying how the transactional information is sent from these applications and from the endpoints over to Call Manager. Call Manager is running a web service, which then interprets that information and sends it to the identity management system, which then goes back and looks at the database, which is now being synchronized to LDAP using the Cisco Directory Sync service. The little triangle with the flux capacitor inside of it is the LDAP icon, right? So that's essentially what they're trying to show us in this particular case. It's kind of how those relationships work. All right. Now, Call Manager does support LDAP, obviously. Two different options that we have, LDAP synchronization or LDAP authentication. Now, you can do synchronization without authentication, but you can't do authentication without synchronization. So if you're going to do authentication, you're going to have to configure the synchronization aspect as well. All right. LDAP is optimized as a directory protocol. It's a very, very efficient protocol. It provides us a quick way of identifying and searching lots and lots of records. And ideally, those records are pretty static. They're probably not changing that often, so we can do some basic reads and hundreds or thousands of reads, but only a couple of writes and update requests are going to be probably transacted. We're not changing too much, with these accounts, and generally, obviously, the benefit of integrating with LDAP is that you have one central repository for all of this information, and then that repository then allows us the ability to manage authentication and end user information at a single point, rather than having to manage it at different points. Like I said, we're running LDAP version 3. That's the latest version. That includes LDAP integration with Microsoft Active Directory, Sun Directory Services, and Open LDAP. All right. Now, there is an important distinction that has to be made between what an end user is and what an application user is, especially when it comes to the corporate directory. All right. Obviously, LDAP provides us that centralized database for storing user information. And like I said, those are the 3 directory services that are available. But we can do user lookup, we can do authentication, and then, of course, we can do provisioning from LDAP into Call Manager. If the only thing I'm doing is synchronization, and I configure and enable the synchronization function using the Cisco Directory Synchronization Service, Cisco DIR Sync on Call Manager, I can synchronize the different attributes from the users. I can do a manual sync. There's a button you can actually push that says synchronize the directory now, or I can do periodic synchronization. Basically the synchronization would occur on a schedule that I define, all right? But when LDAP synchronization is enabled, the users are provisioned from the LDAP directory into Call Manager. Now, you do have the ability of also doing local user provisioning, but that's for your application users. End users are going to be synchronized from LDAP. Application users are treated differently, and they're always going to be provisioned inside of the Call Manager interface. You're not going to provision application users in LDAP. So end users are the ones that are defined in the corporate directory. They're going to end up being synchronized into Call Manager database, and then the application users are only going to be stored in the Call Manager database. You would not define them in the corporate directory. If I do the LDAP authentication as well, that's where we enable the Identity Management System library to do the authentication based on the credentials that are synchronized from the LDAP end users in the corporate directory. And we use that simple bind operation that I described when I was kind of giving you guys a breakdown of the protocol itself. If you're doing LDAP authentication, the end user passwords are authenticated against the corporate directory, not against the Call Manager, right? So we're using LDAP to actually perform the authentication function. Application users and passwords are still locally authenticated. Again, application users are kind of treated independently or differently than end users. Also, Cisco Extension Mobility pins. Extension Mobility provides end users the ability to log in or authenticate to a TUI, a telephony user or interface, basically a fancy term for a phone, so that a profile can be pushed to that phone, and then that phone can then be their desk phone. There's a specific set of pins that are used, well, a security pin that's used to be able to authenticate to that service. That's going to be done locally on Call Manager as well. All right. So if we're maintaining and authenticating application users internally on Call Manager, the accounts, there's a reason Cisco kind of did this, right? They said, you know, we don't want to rely on LDAP to be able to manage this phone system. If LDAP goes down or the integration with LDAP fails, I still want to be able to access Call Manager administration. I still want to be able to configure the platform. So we're going to go ahead and maintain those accounts locally. All right. At the end of the chapter here, they kind of give us a list of supported directories. I'm not going to go through all of them, but pretty much any of the modern domain services or directory services are going to be supported. Which statement accurately describes application users? Application users are associated with a physical person and an interactive login. Application users support LDAP integration. Application users are included in the user directory. None of those are true, which means that the last one is the choice. Application users are associated with Cisco Unified Communication Collaboration Solutions, applications like Contact Center Express, Call Manager Assistant, and so on. Probably the most common application user would be the CCM admin application user, Cisco Call Manager Administrator. All right. All right. So let's start by talking about the synchronization aspect. Remember, LDAP synchronization provides us the ability to synchronize the database that's stored in LDAP into Unified Communications Manager. LDAP uses the Cisco Directory Sync service on Call Manager to synchronize those attributes. Like I said, you could do that manually or you could do it periodically. The feature is not enabled by default. It is something that has to be configured and set up. And then users and users' personal information, the attributes that are basically stored in LDAP, are going to be sent over to Unified Communications Manager. Now, when you go into Call Manager and you go under users and end users, you're going to see that all of that information is read-only. All right. That's because we're pulling that information from the LDAP directory. All right. So the Call Manager itself doesn't send data back to the LDAP server in this particular case. It's only pulling information from the LDAP server. You can still add users locally if you have synchronization enabled. If you have authentication enabled, then you can't add users locally. You're restricted from adding users locally with authentication enabled. All right. Now, what we have to do is we have to establish, and you guys are going to do this in your discovery a little bit later on, but you have to establish a synchronization agreement. All right. Basically, you have to specify the parameters of the synchronization process. And one of the most important components of that is to define where you're pulling the information from, right? In the context of Active Directory, you have a very specific structure that contains end user information. The domain structure is hierarchical, and you can define specifically what container or what object you want to pull that synchronization data from. You don't want to synchronize your entire directory or your entire domain. All right, so that synchronization agreement defines not only obviously when we're going to start the synchronization, how often we're going to do the resynchronization if that resynchronization takes place, but it also allows us to identify when, what kind of information we're trying to pull here. All right, meaning specifically filtering out the type of information. And we can even create contextual filters as well to say, okay, I'm going to pull all the users from this OU, but I'm going to filter out users that are part of the engineering group, or I'm going to filter out these specific types of users. All right. So when you enable synchronization for the first time on the UC platform, the accounts that exist in the directory are going to get imported into the call manager database. Then the end user accounts that get imported, they're going to be activated. If there is data that already exists for those end users, that data is going to be updated. Or if there is no end user that exists, that end user account is going to be created. And so it's very important, and I'm going to kind of go through these bullet points one by one in the book here, because Cisco loves to ask questions about this specific type of stuff on the exam. All right, so number one, if the end user account exists in Call Manager and the synchronization agreement is configured, all pre-existing accounts that were previously synchronized from LDAP are marked inactive in the Call Manager. Okay, that's a very important concept. If a user account exists in Call Manager and the synchronization agreement is set up, any pre-existing accounts previously synchronized from LDAP get marked inactive in Call Manager. All right, that means that we have to pull those accounts from LDAP. The configuration of the synchronization agreement specifies the mapping of the LDAP database attributes to the Call Manager user ID. There's actually several different fields within the end user information within Call Manager. I wouldn't say, well, there's a few. There's a couple of different fields where you have to actually map how you want the information to be populated in Call Manager. Distinguished name is one of those, right? So you'll see that, we'll see that a little bit later on when we go in to look at establishing the synchronization agreement. Some of the fields map over one-to-one. Some of the fields you can pull different variables from LDAP and put them into that particular field within Call Manager. So you have to establish those mappings in the synchronization agreement itself. All right. During the synchronization, accounts from the LDAP database that match a Cisco Call Manager account prompt that Cisco Unified CM account gets, well, basically the account gets marked as active again. So again, even though the account, if the account exists and I'm pulling that account from LDAP, the account will get marked active. This is the second bullet point is really important. After the synchronization is complete, the LDAP synchronized accounts that were not set to active, meaning that basically there wasn't an LDAP entry for that particular account, but the account happened to exist in Call Manager, those get permanently deleted from Call Manager during the garbage collection process, which runs every day at 3:15 a.m. All right, 3:15 a.m. local time to the Call Manager, not universal time or anything like that. All right, that garbage collection time is not configurable. It happens every night at 3:15 in the morning. Okay, if changes are made in the corporate directory, all right, Active Directory synchronization occurs as a full resynchronization, during the next scheduled synchronization period. Meaning that if you make a change in LDAP, you're not going to see that change take effect in Call Manager immediately. We have to wait for the resynchronization process during the next scheduled synchronization period for that information to get populated. All right. Sun One, which I don't know anybody that uses that, but Sun One uses an incremental synchronization process, so changes take effect immediately. You can do a manual resync, by the way. So if you do make a lot of changes and you don't want to wait for that next resynchronization period, you can go in and perform a manual resynchronization as well. All right. Once users get synchronized from LDAP into Call Manager, deletion of the synchronization configuration causes users that were imported by that configuration to be marked as inactive in the database, and then we wait for the garbage collector to come and remove those particular users. All right. All right. So they kind of walk through a scenario here, an example of the timeline of events for the synchronization. And in this particular example, resynchronization is set to run at 11 p.m. every single day. So we do our initial synchronization where we create, delete, disable different accounts. At 8 a.m. on January 1st, an account is disabled or deleted in Active Directory. Okay? All right, so we went into Active Directory, we removed Bob's account. From this time, and during the whole period of A, obviously until we do the periodic resynchronization, password authentication fails for that particular user because Call Manager redirects the authentication to Active Directory, assuming we're doing the authentication component within Active Directory. PIN authentication, extension mobility will still work because, again, extension mobility pins are stored in Call Manager. That periodic resynchronization is scheduled for 11 p.m. on January 1st. Call Manager verifies all the accounts. Any account that was disabled or deleted from Active Directory is tagged in Call Manager as inactive. So after 11 p.m., once that account gets marked inactive, the PIN and the password authentication fails, both for extension mobility as well as LDAP integration. And then finally at 3:15 in the morning, the garbage collection occurs, and that's what permanently deletes those users that were marked as inactive, but they have to be marked as inactive for more than 24 hours. All right, so in this particular case, even though we're running the garbage collection at 3:15 a.m., we don't delete that account that we made inactive at or disabled in LDAP at 8 a.m. because it hasn't been marked as inactive. In fact, it was marked as inactive at 11 p.m. when the periodic resynchronization took place. So it wouldn't be until the next night on January the 4th that the garbage collection would actually take place and remove that particular account. Okay? All right. At 8 a.m. on January 1st, an account is disabled or deleted in Active Directory, and the periodic resynchronization is scheduled for 11 p.m. What is the state of the account at 10:30 p.m. on January 3rd? All right. Well, in this particular case, the account would be inactive, right? Well, actually, it would be deleted because it would have been more than 24 hours in this particular case because they're talking about January 3rd. All right. So, yeah, the account in this particular case would be deleted because we would have passed the 24-hour window. January 2nd would have been the first garbage collection, and at January 2nd, the account would not have been deleted. But at January 3rd, the account would have been deleted because we went past the 24-hour window. Okay? All right. So LDAP authentication, synchronization, as I mentioned before, has to be configured before you can actually enable authentication. When you have LDAP authentication enabled, end user passwords are no longer stored in Call Manager. They're stored in Active Directory or LDAP, in the LDAP directory only. And by the way, that password information is not even replicated to Call Manager because Call Manager is not doing any of the authentication. It's sending all of the authentication to the LDAP directory. Synchronization is not necessarily required. I mentioned a couple of times that you have to do synchronization when you're doing authentication. It is highly recommended, but it's not actually physically required because basically there's really no reason you wouldn't do it, right? You want the corporate directory to be published and to be populated because if somebody pushes the directory button on the phone, you want them to be able to see that corporate directory, which we're going to be pulling from LDAP because you're still going to be managing the data in LDAP and you want that information to be synchronized with Call Manager. But you can do authentication alone without synchronization. It's just not recommended. All right. You would have to manage all of the users locally if synchronization is not enabled. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to run authentication without synchronization. All right. Now, stuff that's specific to call manager, like endpoints that we're controlling, like CTI endpoints and stuff like that, are stored in call manager. That's not information that you're going to get from LDAP. But in order for us to be able to identify the users that are controlling devices, we have to have an end user in the directory. So call manager has to have that information. And obviously to make that work, it makes sense that we would go ahead and do the synchronization. So we don't want to have different management for accounts and different processes for authentication. It's kind of interesting when you look at the book. It says here, LDAP synchronization is not mandatory, but it's recommended. They literally say that, right? And then you look at the last part of it. It says to avoid disparate management of user accounts. Let me scroll down. To avoid disparate management of user accounts in the two databases, LDAP synchronization is a prerequisite when configuring LDAP authentication. It's a little bit misleading, right? A little bit confusing because one, they say you don't really need to do synchronization with authentication, but the other suggests that you do. But what they're actually saying in this case is what I was basically saying, is that it just doesn't make any sense that you would do authentication without synchronization, because you would have to actually literally go in and create the accounts in Call Manager to be able to allow those accounts to be used for authentication, even though the authentication is going to be performed by LDAP. Okay? How does the Cisco Unified Communications Manager interact with a synchronized end user when the end user tries to enter extension mobility credentials, a username and PIN to log into a Cisco phone? All right. Well, we know that authentication occurs locally. Extension mobility is always going to be done locally. PINs are not stored by LDAP. They're stored in Call Manager. Okay. All right. Now, one of the things that I mentioned is the attribute mapping within LDAP. We have specific attributes in Active Directory, like a SAM account name, mail, employee number, telephone number, user principal name. Notice there we have 5 different options. Those get mapped over to user ID. So we have to choose which one of those fields in the Active Directory structure I want to map over to user ID. So that's one of the parameters or the attributes that I have to map in the synchronization agreement. First name is always going to be given name. Middle name can be either middle name or initials. So again, in the synchronization agreement, I have to specify what I want to be mapped over to the middle name. The last name is always the surname. The manager ID is always manager. Department is always department. Phone number can either be IP phone or telephone number. So I have to map those parameters. Mail ID can either be the mail or the SAM account name, so I have to map that information over. And then the directory URI can be either MSRTC, RTC SIP, primary user address, mail, or none, so I have to map those attributes over. There are some defaults that take place when you're creating the synchronization agreement. The only one that actually has to be specified is user ID. I believe the other ones, you guys can confirm this when you do your discovery, but I believe the other ones will automatically choose one of those fields when they're mapping over the middle name, the phone number, and the mail ID and the directory URI. But don't quote me on that. I would have to take a look at the synchronization agreement configuration to see that. But obviously, the whole point here is that we're trying to identify which LDAP attributes get mapped over to which Call Manager attributes exist within the Call Manager database. All right. So that's something that you will have to decide. When configuring LDAP synchronization, which three Active Directory attributes can be mapped to the call manager user ID? Well, based on the database or based on the table, it's SAM account name, telephone number, or user principal name, right? User ID actually has others, but those are the three choices that are listed in the question there. So the answer would be SAM account name, let's see, telephone number, and user principal name. Okay? All right. So the next thing we're going to take a look at are the different considerations when we're setting up our synchronization agreement. Kind of those mappings that we talked about. Call manager user ID, for example, has to be mapped to a specific LDAP attribute and so on. The call manager user ID, which really defines the user within call manager, needs to be mapped over to one of those fields. And typically it's going to be probably SAM account name is probably going to be the attribute that we're going to use. But when we're designing our LDAP synchronization, depending on the directory server that's used, LDAP synchronization can be done in a couple of different ways. We can do a full synchronization, right? Synchronization can actually be done in a couple of different ways. We can kind of see a snippet of that below there, but full synchronization or incremental synchronization. Now, if we're using Active Directory, full synchronization is really the only method that we have, unless we do a manual synchronization during the, if we go into the LDAP system, there's a button that we can click to do full synchronization or manual synchronization, I should say. Other directory structures do provide incremental synchronization options, and changes are propagated as they occur. But being that most of the time we are using LDAP with Active Directory, full synchronization is what we're going to have available for us. The synchronization agreement, which you guys will be setting up in your discovery as part of your configuration of the discovery, the synchronization agreement allows us to define essentially the subdomain or the domain within the LDAP structure that we're going to synchronize from. We have to specify those mappings. Like I said, different attributes have to be mapped across to the call manager attribute. And then we establish that synchronization agreement. Now, you cannot synchronize or have multiple types of synchronization agreements. You can't have a mix of Active Directory synchronization agreements and LDAP and other LDAP servers. So you can only choose to synchronize to one structure, one domain architecture, which is typically not a problem anyway, because it's very rare that you would actually be running multiple domain structures anyway. All right. The search base is how you define where you're going to pull the information from the directory itself. We designate the search base by specifying within the directory tree where I should start searching for user information. All right. In the context of Active Directory and domains, the users are organized into a hierarchical structure, and we can use a search base string that we define within the synchronization agreement to control which user groups get imported. Not only can we control which groups get imported, we can even create specific filters that say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull the information. Search base 1 says, I'm going to go ahead and pull the information from Site 1 users. I'm going to pull the users from engineering, and I'm going to pull the users from marketing, but I'm going to filter out John Doe. So you can get that granular if you want to. And you can set up multiple synchronization agreements. So you might want to, for example, eliminate service accounts, or maybe you have administrative accounts or service accounts that are commingled with other user accounts. Depending on how the structure of your your tree is set up will depend on how complicated the synchronization agreement it has to be. You don't have to specify the root domain. You can actually just point to just specific points within the tree itself. So in this diagram, we're seeing an example with 3 top-level OUs. 2 of the OUs are specific to users. So OU1 is Site 1 users, and OU2 is Site 2 users, and then we have a service account OU. All right, so we have 2 synchronization agreements that are configured. One synchronization agreement specifies that we're going to use search space 1. We're going to import users J White, John Doe, and J Green. And the other synchronization agreement says we're going to go into search space 2 and import users M Brown, M Black, and D Green. All right. The CCM DAR manager account obviously not going to be imported because we don't actually have a synchronization agreement for the service account OU, which makes sense. All right, so this entire agreement that you configure and the structure of the directory allows you to control which users actually get synchronized into the system. And then we can import that information into the call manager database. Call manager actually does a bind operation to the LDAP directory using a service account that you specify. It could be an administrative account. Usually we like to have a separate service account just for this transaction. We don't want to reuse a domain admin account or a generic administrator account for that. But that account does have to be in the directory itself. And of course, the authentication credentials have to match. So usually that we would just create a service account that provides us the ability to only look at the objects that we need within the domain structure based on the user search base that we've specified within the configuration of the synchronization agreement. All right, so that synchronization agreement has to specify the FQDN of that account, that service account. So the account can actually reside outside of the actual configured search space where we're pulling the information from. It can be anywhere in the domain, actually. All right, and in this particular case, the CCM DIR MGR account is actually what's used for the synchronization, and that's not included in our search space for incorporating the account information into Call Manager. All right, and we can actually use filters, like I said. We can specify that all accounts under one subtree are included and synchronized, and other accounts we might filter out some of those accounts. All right, so you'll see this when you guys go into your discovery and you do the configuration, that you have these options to kind of filter all this information out. All right, so the synchronization agreement allows us to synchronize users within the domain. But we cannot synchronize users outside of that domain or in a child domain because of the way that Call Manager integrates with the directory itself. So in this example, we see 3 different synchronization agreements to import different users. Search space 1 specifies the root of the tree. Search space 1 does not import users that exist in the child domains. Because the scope of that search space is CLL-collab.internal, which is going to incorporate the corporate user J Green and the service account directory manager 1, which, by the way, you can filter again that out. You don't necessarily, just because you specified the root domain doesn't mean that you're required to synchronize all of the users from the root domain. You can actually create a filter. All right, each subdomain then has to have a separate search space to be able to import that information. When we do enable synchronization on the Active Directory forest, if it does contain multiple trees, every kind of branch of that tree has to have a separate synchronization agreement, and then that information gets imported. All right, there is a default search filter string that gets applied as well. One of the default clauses is to say, I'm not going to give you any of the account information that's marked as disabled in Active Directory. So if an account is disabled in Active Directory, it's not going to be synchronized to Call Manager. You can modify those filters, like I said, as well. All right. Now, with regard to authentication, there are some design considerations as well. Once we've enabled LDAP authentication, we manage end user passwords through the directory, but again, those extension mobility pens, they're going to still be managed with Call Manager. All right, so the couple of bullet points here: specific user accounts within the corporate directory could have read-only access. We can manage end user passwords at LDAP from within the corporate directory interface. We manage application user passwords from Call Manager administration pages. Remember, those application users are always going to be separate. All right. We manage end user PINs from Call Manager administration, and we enable single login for Call Manager administrators by adding their corresponding end user to the Call Manager super user group, meaning we don't have to have a separate account for application users and end users. If the application user also happens to be an end user on the system. All right, we just simply have to assign that super user group. We'll talk about access control groups in a little bit. All right. So they do mention a couple of best practice standards here when we're doing LDAP authentication. Create an account within the corporate directory that allows Call Manager to authenticate to the corporate directory. In other words, don't use, kind of an already established domain admin account that gives you the ability to read information from the LDAP directory. Make sure that you limit the capability of that service account to only read the objects that the search spaces are looking for. Make sure the account is set to never expire. And then, of course, make sure the password for that account in the directory is synchronized with the password that's configured on Call Manager, because if the passwords change and the passwords don't match, obviously the synchronization process is going to fail. All right. Enable LDAP authentication in Call Manager by utilizing those credentials that we set up. We do this under the LDAP Manager distinguished name and LDAP password under the configuration. There's an LDAP authentication screen that you guys are going to access in your discovery where you configure that information. And then you specify the search space where you're going to pull the information for the end users from. All right, that's what allows us to incorporate that LDAP authentication piece, or both synchronization and authentication. In this case, they're specifically talking about authentication. All right. We manage the end user passwords from the corporate directory. Like I said, we manage the PINs from Call Manager and so on. All right. So how do I set up this LDAP integration? We need to activate the Cisco Directory Sync service. That is a feature service. Like I said, it's not turned on by default. That has to be enabled. We need to enable the LDAP directory synchronization. If optionally, right? We don't have to necessarily, but if we want to synchronize the users, we need to. We need to create our filters. A filter is not the same thing as the synchronization agreement. Filter is kind of more specific to what we're trying to filter within the context of what we're searching through, right? So we'll see. I don't know if they're going to have you guys do any kind of specific filtering in the discovery, but you will see the place where filters can be applied, where you can actually filter out specific variables or for specific accounts and so on when you're doing the synchronization. Then we configure the LDAP directory synchronization. So there's a little checkbox to enable the synchronization, and then there's a configuration option, and then we configure the authentication if we want to do the authentication as well, all right, for the end user password authentication. All right. Of course, you guys will be going through this in the discovery a little bit later on. All right. If we're deploying Active Directory. And we have a distributed Active Directory topology, meaning that we have multiple domain controllers that are geographically distributed. Obviously, depending on the location of those controllers, where they're physically located, the processing time might be insufficient. All right, so if we're using a domain controller for the authentication agreement, if it doesn't contain that particular account, searching for that user across all of the domain or across all the other domain controllers has to take place. And that could change how quickly the interaction occurs with the end user itself. So they do recommend, obviously, to identify or at least locate those users locally to Call Manager. All right, you can select the global catalog, but the global catalog is missing a few attributes, so there are some limitations to that. All right, I'm not going to get into the rest of these details. I don't think it's that critical. Let's just kind of move down to the questions here. What is the minimum permission needed for Call Manager to use the LDAP account to synchronize LDAP users? Well, the minimum is to synchronize users is to read, right? We don't actually have to push any information from Call Manager to LDAP, so we just need to simply read that information. All right, and then which service should you activate to enable LDAP synchronization in the Call Manager? That's going to be the directory sync service. All right, which is right here, the Cisco directory sync service. Okay, now this next section that we're going to talk about can be a little bit confusing. It took me a while to kind of figure this out on my own, but several Call Manager features within Call Manager require user accounts for authentication. They could be, of course, the administrative web page, the user web pages, unified attendant console, extension mobility, unified manager assistant, and so on. Cisco phones themselves have the ability to browse corporate and personal directories to find different directory numbers for a user, and Call Manager is provisioned with user information like the first and last name to provide that specific directory browsing functionality. You can also subscribe Cisco phones to different IP phone services, which may require user logins before providing access to that particular service. Users can authenticate with their username. They can authenticate with a password, which is alphanumeric. They can authenticate with a PIN, which is simply numeric, depending on whatever that application might be. Call Manager sends those authentication requests to that internal library. We talked about that previously, called the Identity Management System Library, which is then responsible for authenticating those user credentials against the user database. All right, and as I mentioned previously, there are basically two different types of user accounts in Call Manager. We have end user accounts, which are associated with the individual end users that have interactive logins. And again, those end users can have administrative roles based on the user group or the role configuration. And that's really what this whole section is about, is identifying what a role is and what a group is. We also have application users that get associated to applications like Contact Center Express, Call Manager Assistant, Attendant Console, and so on. All right. The attributes that get associated with end users are separated into three different categories. Attributes get associated with end users are separated into personal and organizational settings, which includes things like the user ID, the first name, the last name, manager ID, you know, those attributes that we're going to get from LDAP. Then you have the password, and then you have the Call Manager specific administrative settings, PINs, SIP digest credentials, the user privileges themselves, so groups and roles. That's not going to be managed by LDAP. That's going to be managed by Call Manager. Also the associated PCs, whatever control devices that user's associated to, their directory number, and so on. All right. So Call Manager allows you as an administrator to assign user privileges to different application users and end users. And those privileges can be assigned based on, access to administration functions and user web pages, access to specific administrative functions within the platform itself, what we call role-based access control, or RBAC, access to application interfaces like SOAP interfaces. SOAP is the Simple Object Access Protocol. We'll talk about that later. And CTI, computer telephony integration. And then the privileges are configured by configuring two separate entities. And we can see them kind of listed on this diagram here. A user group, which is a collection of application users and end users that have kind of similar privilege levels, and user roles, which are resources for a specific application. So we see the users on the left, they get assigned to a group. Those roles get assigned to groups. The arrows kind of represent the direction of configuration. So groups don't get assigned to roles, roles get assigned to groups, and then roles provide us access to different applications. Read access, no access, read and update access. That's the flow chart information that I was showing you guys before. All right. Each role refers to only one application, and each application has a lot of resources. So access privileges get configured per application resource in the role configuration itself, and then roles get assigned to the groups. All right, so this diagram kind of illustrates that process. We have essentially two groups in this particular case. We have 4 different users, and these 4 users are have access to 2 different applications. Well, application 1 and application 2 in this particular case. All right, the needs of the 4 users are achieved through the assignment of these 2 different user groups, and that's what's important in this particular case. All right. So I want to kind of break this down a little bit so you have an idea of what's happening in this case. I know it seems relatively simple, but it can get a little bit complicated. User 1 and User 2 are assigned to group number 1. User 3 is also assigned to group number 1, which has 2 roles assigned to it for application 1. Role number 1 and role number 2. The privilege level of role 1 and role 2 are referring to the same application, but provide different levels of access or different privileges to those particular resources. This overlapping configuration can actually be configured to give kind of the highest or lowest overlapping privilege level depending on what your overall goal is. User 3 is actually assigned to both groups, Group 1 and Group 2. Group 1 and Group 2 have a role assignment of 1, 2, and 3. Actually, Group number 2 in this case only has a role assignment of role 2 and 3. Group 1 has a role assignment of role 1 and role 2. Both role 1 and role 2 control different privileges to application number 1. Role 3 assigns different privileges to application number 2. Within the application itself, we also have resources. Resources could be, let's say, for example, let me give you an example. Let's say I want to give somebody access to the Call Manager administration page. That would be considered the application. Within that application, we have access to the dial plan, we have access to gateways, we have access to devices, to phones, to users, all of the configuration elements within the Call Manager administration page. Those would be the resources. So you could say, for example, I'm going to assign or create a user, and I'm going to assign them to a group that is a read-only group for troubleshooting or for verification of the configuration. And so I would provide them CCM admin access to the call manager administration page, but I would provide them only read access to all the resources within the call manager administration, if that makes sense. All right. So it really depends on how you've established the configuration, as to what resource or application that particular user has access to. This is more of a generic representation, obviously, of the structure. So users get assigned to groups, roles get assigned to groups, roles allow us to reference an application, and then within that application we have specific resources that we can access. And we can define 3 different levels of access to that resource: none, read, update, or read only. All right. Obviously, the goal of the configuration, particularly in this case, is to create administrative groups that have different types of access to the call manager configuration pages, what we would refer to as CCM admin. Junior level administrators might have read-only privileges to different configuration pages, and whereas you might have other administrators that might have access. Maybe you have an administrator that their sole function is to add phones and add end devices, but they can't manage gateways, they can't manage the dial plan, and so on. All right. Now, Call Manager does have lots of different kind of default roles defined. There's standard roles. Some of those roles get associated with the Call Manager administration. There are also many predefined roles in Call Manager, but let's take a look at a couple of them. Two of the standard roles in Call Manager administration are the standard CCM admin administrator role and the standard CCM admin read-only role. All right. Standard CCM admin administration really provides us the ability to update Call Manager information, right? The Call Manager administration, where the read-only only gives us read-only access, to that system. Now, we can't modify those predefined roles, but we can copy them. We can rename them, and then the copies we can then reconfigure as needed. All right. There are also a lot of different user groups that are standard as well. A couple of examples of standard user groups includes the standard CCM super user group and the standard CCM read-only group. The super users get associated with the role of standard CCM administration, and the user group read-only is associated with the CCM read-only admin group. So you kind of have to go through and look at these default groups and how they're configured, and you can kind of walk through them to see what those privileges are. There's a CCM super users group. There's a standard CCM admin read-only group. There's a CAR, call admission, CAR admin users group, a CCM server maintenance group, a server monitoring group. There's a phone administration group, an end user group, and a gateway administration group. So it just depends on what your overall objective is with, defining what roles and responsibilities these users have within the system. All right. Now, if we look at the roles overview, before we actually provision the end users in the system, we have to identify the standard roles and access control groups that are configured by default. And like I said, we have standard roles that are predefined. Those come installed with Call Manager. We can't actually edit those roles. We can copy them, and then we can edit the copies of those roles. And then we have the custom roles that we can create as well. Depending on what we're trying to provision will depend on what we want to provide them access to. Are they going to get access to Call Manager administration? Are they going to get access to the call detailed reporting functions, the dialed number analyzer tool, CTI integration, you know, for controlling endpoints and whatnot through a Jabber client or something like that, and so on. And like I said, the different privilege types are read access or update access, or no access at all. We could do that as well. All right. The end user administrative roles, like I said, we have standard CCM end users. That would provide a user with access to things like the self-care portal. Self-care portal allows the end user to manage their phones or their endpoints. And we can also provide CTI access if we do like the standard CTI enabled role. It takes a little bit of getting used to. You know, when you define end users, there are some roles that are already defined by default or already assigned to the user by default. And then you can customize that on a per user basis. All right. There are some advanced role configurations as well. Like I said, we can kind of go through the process of implementing, you know, specific access for users to give them access to very, very specific functions within Call Manager. We can see the different access control groups, you know, that are listed here. You know, standard CCM admin users, standard read-only. I mentioned a few of these already. Standard CTI enabled, standard CTI allowed call monitoring, standard CCM super users. I'm not going to get into specifically what each of these groups provide, but when you navigate through, you can go into these groups and then you can drill down into the roles and see what applications they have access to and what functionality they have access to within that application. But we're not going to get into that in this section here. All right, which configuration element should be assigned to a user to grant access to Call Manager resources? Well, if I want to have access to Call Manager resources, I need to be assigned to a group, right? The access control group is what ties me or gives me the ability to access different resources. All right. All right, the next topic we're going to talk about is feature group templates in Call Manager. The feature group template gives us the ability to provision and deploy our end users with their specific phones and their phone lines. These feature group templates give us the ability to assign common phone configuration elements, phone line configuration components, as well as different service settings to all the users that are assigned to that particular feature group template. And if we actually have users that are assigned based on, you know, or being enabled based on self-provisioning for the end users, we can use these feature group templates to allow those users to also provision and set up their own phones with their desired phone configuration, phone line settings, and service settings. In the context of feature group templates, there are basically two different types of templates or profiles that we create. We call a service profile and a user profile. Now the user profile is all of the common phone and phone line settings. We actually have to configure the user profile with something called a universal line template, which then assigns the common phone line settings, and a universal device template, which assigns all of the common phone settings. Again, these are very helpful if we're doing some sort of kind of self-provisioning, allowing users to configure their own phones. We also have service profiles, which are all the common settings for Call Manager services like conferencing, directory services, and so on. All right. Now, if we're deploying the IM and Presence service, we can even set up a feature group template to do things like LDAP synchronized users with IM&P capabilities. So we have that as well. When we're setting up the feature group templates to include individual user profiles or service profiles, we can then assign that feature group template to an end user. That user profile and service profile and those settings that are assigned there are going to propagate through to any new phones that particular end user provisions. Auto-generated directory numbers are based on information that's actually going to be found in the directory and defined based on a mask that's going to be applied to the phone number found in that particular directory. or it could be the numbers that we're obtaining from the directory number pools that are defined within our LDAP synchronization agreement. If we actually have a mask defined on the synchronization agreement to allow for the generation of E.164 directory numbers, then we have to follow a couple of rules, right? If the mask is left empty, Call Manager obtains all the digits and anything leading, the leading plus if it's present in the number from the directory itself. X could be used as a wildcard character set in the mask, just like we see within Unified Communications Manager. X is the uppercase X in this particular case. The wildcard matches on digits and the plus sign as well. Remember, we use the plus sign for our globalized numbers, our E.164 numbers. Wildcards in the masks are filled out from the right. All right, that's always the case. When we talked about this a little bit later, we will talk about this a little bit later on in a different course where we talk about things like voicemail profiles, and we specify wildcard masks for establishing what numbers are going to be propagated based on a voicemail profile. The unified wildcards in the mask are excuse me, the unfilled, not unified, unfilled wildcards in the mask are going to be removed. As an alternate to creating directory numbers based on information from LDAP, directory numbers for new users can also be obtained from predefined number pools. Each pool is defined by a starting number and an ending number, and then those directory number pools can be published. They also support E.164 numbers as well. We can actually define up to 5 different pools. Numbers are assigned from the first pool until that particular pool is exhausted, and then we'll go into the next pool and so on. Now, we do have the ability to do automatic line creation. Automatic line creation is based on 2 different features that we talked about. The feature group template, which is assigned to the directory in the directory synchronization agreement as we populate users into the database, and then the universal line template, which is chosen in the user profile, which then in turn is chosen from that feature group template. So we have our LDAP directory feature group template that we assign. Then we go into the feature group template user profile. That user profile references the universal device template and the universal line template, and then that universal line template has all the characteristics as an example for those particular line settings. You know, what is the description of the line, what partition is the line going to be in, what is the calling search space, and so on. All right. We also, and I mentioned this kind of in the beginning of this discussion, have 2 different, have the feature group template configuration, which is kind of the head end or the main component of defining these templates, which point to the user profile and the service profile. Again, we're talking about being able to assign common services, common configurations to these users that are ultimately being integrated or synchronized from LDAP. When you actually configure a feature group template to include the user profile and a service profile, and then we assign that feature group template to the user, any phone, again, that user provisions is going to inherit those properties. All right. If we're deploying Call Manager and I am in presence, we can also integrate that presence capability. The profiles contain things like common directory number settings, device settings, and then we can actually set up different types of user profiles that contain the most common directory number settings and device settings that the users are going to require, and then assign each user profile to the users that require those particular settings. We can configure the user profiles for different groups of users in our company according to the type of phone it is, the phone line, the phone setting requirements for those users. So we can have multiple profiles established. For those users that are, again, doing the self-provisioning, the phone and phone line settings from the profile get applied to the new phones that particular user provisions. If the user is not enabled for user provisioning or self-provisioning, the user profile settings can be applied to new phones that the administrator provisions on behalf of that particular end user. All right. All right. So user profile settings, again, include different templates, the universal line template and the device template. Line template is all the characteristics of the line itself, directory number, description, partition, etc. And the device template would be all the common settings that we would see on the phone. All right. Which two profiles should be assigned to a feature group template? And the answer in this particular case, it's going to be a service profile, which we saw previously, and the user profile. All right. All right, let's get into discovery number 5, configuring and troubleshooting LDAP integration with Cisco Unified Communications Manager. Now, we've already gone through our discussions and talked about what LDAP provides, in the context of a standard method for accessing or even modifying information that's stored within the directories within our UC applications. But we know that this provides the enterprise the ability to centralize all the user information into a single repository that's going to be available for all of our Unified Communications applications. It'll give us the ability to reduce the overall workload that we have for adds, moves, and changes, and so on, because we have this central repository. In this particular discovery, we are going to configure LDAP synchronization between our call manager server here and the LDAP application that's running on this server here. All right. We're going to configure LDAP authentication. We're going to test that authentication against a specific user. In this particular case, it's going to be JDoe against that LDAP directory. We're also going to configure LDAP filters to limit how LDAP synchronization takes place based on our synchronization policy. And we want to pick out a specific subset of users from the LDAP directory. And then we're going to modify the object attributes on the LDAP server to see what the impact of that is in our call manager after we do resynchronization. We're also going to change the LDAP attribute for the user ID from the normal SAM account name to the user principal name. We'll see how that impacts call manager after the synchronization. And then finally, we'll wrap up this discovery by looking at troubleshooting common mistakes that might be made during LDAP synchronization and during the LDAP synchronization process, using traces in call manager and looking at those traces in the real-time monitoring tool. All right. Now, as far as the endpoints go, or the endpoint, we don't really have to worry about that. All of that stuff is already done and configured. Our focus in this particular lab is on LDAP. We have PC1 of 10.15200, as we always have had in our discoveries, and we also have our call manager at 10.155 and our Windows server running at 10.15100. All right, now again, we know that LDAP synchronization provides us the ability to provision end users in the system. So in our first task, we're going to go ahead and configure that synchronization between the LDAP server and our call manager. All right, when we're integrating call manager with a directory service in LDAP, we can configure the LDAP integration in a couple of different ways, right? We can use LDAP integration, to synchronize personal and organizational settings, password information, and then also unified. Well, we can't use LDAP to synchronize things like PIN and digest credentials and the groups and roles, the PCs, the control devices, things like extension mobility profiles, CAPF presence groups, and mobility information. All that stuff has to be maintained locally on the call manager platform. If I'm doing password integration, with no LDAP integration, all the passwords are going to be stored locally on call manager. If I'm doing LDAP synchronization only, then that's going to be done on the call manager server as well. But if I am running LDAP authentication, the passwords can be synchronized from the LDAP directory service. Personal settings like user ID, first name, middle name, last name, manager user ID, department, phone number, mail ID. Again, with no LDAP integration, we can manage all those components directly in the user definitions in Call Manager. If we're doing LDAP synchronization, then that type of information will be synchronized from LDAP. It'll be replicated to the local storage or the local user storage on Call Manager, as well as with LDAP authentication. All right. With LDAP synchronization, only the personal and organizational settings are going to get replicated. Again, the password is going to be managed locally on the system. All right. If I run both options, then we're basically electing to synchronize everything. So the first thing we're going to do is let's go into our PC here, and we are going to log into our PC and use this just as our interface to Unified Communications Manager. Where is my mouse? There it is. All right. C0LL at B. And I'll just go into my browser here, and I will go ahead and just authenticate to 10.1.1.10.155. Oops. There we go. That's our Call Manager. Accept our self-signed certificate, as we've always done with all these discoveries, and then we authenticate to Call Manager. Now, when we're configuring LDAP in this platform, everything is going to be done under the System menu, and we have a sub menu configuration that's available to us. In the configuration, it's going to be under the LDAP configuration. We have our LDAP system, LDAP directory, LDAP authentication, custom filters, and LDAP search. But before we can actually go in and start to configure all the LDAP parameters, the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the services are running adequately on the platform. All right, so let's go to Tools and Service Activation. We're going to select our publisher, Call Manager Publisher, and we would do this on the publisher anyway, even if we had multiple servers within the cluster, because the database synchronization should occur with the publisher, and then that information is going to be replicated to the subscribers within the cluster. But we need to make sure that the Cisco Directory Sync service is enabled on the platform. All right, let's see, scroll right here, and I should be able to get my scroll bar here. Let's see, CIR, DIR Sync. Let me just do a Control F. DIR Sync, there we go. All right, that service is presently deactivated, so I'm going to check that and hit Save. It takes a minute or so for that service to go ahead and activate once I save the configuration. Let's go back to the top of the page here. There we go. And I should see that service listed as active once I allow the Call Manager to kind of activate that service. It shouldn't really take a whole lot of time, but it does take, it's not instant. All right, so let's go ahead and scroll down here. Let me do a quick find, DIR Sync. We can see that the service is now activated. So what we're going to do now is go back into our Call Manager administration page. All right, and we are going to now, let's see, let's just go to, we've got some scaling issues here on the browser, so we'll just go this way. It's probably easier. We're going to go back to our Call Manager administration page, and we're going to go ahead and look at the users that are presently provisioned within Call Manager. Right now, we should only have one user called Phone View, and we can select Phone View, and we'll go ahead and do Delete Selected to delete that particular user, because we're going to now synchronize all the users from our LDAP directory. All right, now, straightforward, we need to first go in, and we need to go in and activate our LDAP system. All right, we're going to enable synchronization. This is going to be from Microsoft Active Directory. These are some of the other LDAP server types that are available if you do want to use other LDAP servers. But for the most part, Microsoft Active Directory is probably going to be the most common. We'll go ahead and leave the attribute for user ID as SAM account name for now. But you can see we have 4 or 5 different options here for mapping the user ID in Call Manager to an LDAP attribute in the LDAP directory. That's something that we can also provision and set up in our synchronization policy as well. So we'll go ahead and save that. Save that configuration. We'll go into System now, and we're going to go back to LDAP, and now we're going to configure the directory itself. Cisco, by the way, when they're setting up all these properties in Call Manager, usually the way that they're listed within the menu is the order that you would typically configure these components in. So that's kind of useful. We're going to go ahead and add a new directory. We'll call this just LDAP server, and we need to have an account that allows us to authenticate. That's going to be administrator at, and we'll specify the domain in this case. You don't always have to do that. It just depends on what the search space is when you're actually setting up this information. The password is going to be our domain password, which, by the way, does have to match, of course, what's configured in Active Directory. Let me make sure I type that correctly, C0LL@B. And then we're going to specify our search base. All right, we obviously need to make sure that the search space is referencing the specific locations where I want to pull the users from. So that's going to be in users and specifically within the domain CLL-collab and internal. All right, and we talked about what all these CN and DC and what those represent in the lecture portion. Let's go ahead and specify our synchronization. We're going to perform a resync. Let's do a resync every 6 hours in this particular case. And we do want to synchronize our users only, and we're not going to apply a filter just yet. We'll go ahead and apply that filter a little bit later on. Now here's where we can do all the mapping from the fields that exist in LDAP to the fields that exist in Call Manager. User ID, middle name, manager ID, phone number, title, mobile number, directory URI, and so on. Middle name, we're going to go ahead and leave as middle name, but we also have initials that are available. Phone number, we're going to go ahead and set this to IP phone in our particular example. It just depends on how it's provisioned within Active Directory. And the directory URI, we're going to actually go ahead and put that as the email address. As far as the access control groups, in this particular case, our access control group, we're going to add, in this case, standard CCM end users. We want these users to be put into the standard CCM end users control group. So this is standard CCM end users. We'll add that selected group. So as the users are provisioned, this identifies what group they need to belong to. And then we have the host name. So we need to scroll down. I'm just going to go ahead and do a search on host name. And that'll take me to the bottom of the page. And I'm going to put in our Active Directory server. We can add additional LDAP servers here for redundancy. Also notice the port that we're using. When Call Manager LDAP authentication is configured for secure mode, that's going to use port 636 or 3269, and we have to upload all the LDAP authentication server certificates and intermediate certificates as Tomcat Trust to the IAM in Presence server node. In this exercise, we're pointing to the root of the domain. Basically, we're going to synchronize all the users in the domain. In a production environment, you would probably want to be a little bit more granular as to what you're pointing to. And then by adding the users to this standard CCM end user control group, the accounts can get access to the Call Manager end user pages. And we could, of course, modify that as needed. All right, so we'll go ahead and save that configuration. And then we're going to go back to the top of our screen here, and we're going to do a perform full sync now. All right, now depending on the size of the database and depending on what the You know, search space includes will depend on how long that synchronization takes place. In our case, it shouldn't really take that long because we don't have a lot of users in our environment. So if I go to user management and I go to end users, we can see now we have active enabled LDAP synchronized users in our database. Now, if I go into John Doe, all right, as an example, we can see that we can't change any of the personal information, right? Because that stuff was synchronized. User ID, last name, first name, display name, those types of things. That was all synchronized from Call Manager, from LDAP. But we do see that we have the ability to change the password and the PIN and digest credentials, and we actually can even convert this user to a local user if we want to. All right, you know, again, we're just doing the Active Directory synchronization. We're not doing the authentication. All right, so we can go ahead and even come in here and change the credentials. I can change this C0LL at B and C0LL at B. And the PIN, we're using a PIN of 12345. And 12345, and then I can save that information, right? So just to kind of demonstrate the fact that we're able to actually save that information for that particular end user. Now I can even come in here and I can go to the user UCM user page, 10.1.5.5, UCM user, and I should be able to authenticate with JDoe with a password of C0LL at, oops, let me try that again, C0LL at B, and I should be able to authenticate to the self-care portal. All right, so we've confirmed that authentication is still occurring even though we haven't done any specific authentication for this particular user from LDAP. We're doing the local authentication. All right, so our next task then is to set up the authentication. LDAP authentication allows user authentication against the LDAP directory. When we're using LDAP authentication, LDAP is going to manage the passwords. And we talked about this in our lecture, right? We said, look, the PINs, extension mobility authentication, that's still going to be maintained locally within Call Manager, but the actual user password is going to be synchronized. Call Manager authenticates user credentials in this particular case against the corporate LDAP directory when the feature is enabled. The passwords themselves are not stored in Call Manager. They're also not replicated to Call Manager. They're going to be simply stored in the directory. Personal user data is now also going to be managed by the LDAP, and that's going to be replicated into Call Manager as well. The Call Manager user data, like the associated PC, controlled devices, stuff like that, that's still going to be stored in the Call Manager database for the individual users. So because of that, the username has to be known by the Call Manager database to be able to assign users to devices and so on, and the LDAP directory. So to avoid separate management of user accounts in these two different databases, LDAP synchronization is actually going to be mandatory with LDAP authentication. All right, so let's go ahead and go into our system. We're going to go into LDAP, and now we're going to go into the LDAP authentication piece. Let's go ahead and re-authenticate. C0LL at B. And we're going to configure the authentication piece now. So system, LDAP authentication. All right, now we're going to set up a new LDAP authentication process here. We simply have to check the box. There's only one type of LDAP authentication you can configure. There's multiple synchronization policies you can configure. So you notice that when we set that up initially, we were able to add a policy here. We didn't have the add option because there's only one LDAP authentication that you can specify. So administrator at CLL-collab.internal. make sure I spell it right. Do internal. There we go. And the password is C0LL at B. C0LL at B. And then the search space is going to be the same search space that we specified before. The whole domain, the root, CLL-collab, comma, DC equals internal. All right. We'll go ahead and specify the IP address of the Active Directory server. And we can, again, add additional servers as needed. All right. So we're going to go ahead and save this configuration. All right. We don't have to do a resynchronization in this case because all we're doing in this particular case is we're turning on the authentication function. That's our goal here. All right. So let's go ahead and go back to the UCM user. So 10.1.5.5 / UCM user. And let's go ahead and try and authenticate again with JDO using that same password that we had set previously, C0LL at B. And we should see, well, hold on one second. Why did it not fail? That should have failed. Let's do one more thing here. Let me just do a quick resync. Administrator. C0LL at B. And I just want to do a quick resync on LDAP. Oops. LDAP synchronization. Directory. Find. LDAP server. And let's perform a full sync. All right. And let's log out of John Doe here and try to log in again. JDoe C0LL at B. All right. So it already said we don't have access, but we can see now the username and password is incorrect. That's because the password that's stored in LDAP is not the same as the one we had set. You know, if the login will fail, but if I go ahead and put in the username and the password that's actually stored, JDoe, oops, in LDAP, JDoe C0, it's a slightly different password. Well, that's interesting. Haven't seen that before, logging into the user here. Try that one more time. Oh, that's interesting. Why is it saying that that's not available? All right, I just refreshed the screen and it was able to authenticate. Not sure why I was getting that error previously. Maybe because I was kind of doing an active synchronization at the time and we couldn't authenticate when we were synchronizing. But in any event, we were able to authenticate now with the password that was synchronized from our LDAP directory. And if I go to user management and I go to my end user, I'm using the same browser for these, so it's getting a little bit confused here as to what application is being accessed. But if I go to my end users and I go ahead and find JDoe as an example, you'll notice now that the password field is not a field that's available for me to be able to change within Call Manager itself, right? I don't know why it's showing up like that. That's an issue with the lab itself. But you can see password is no longer an option in this particular case. All right, so we're now doing LDAP synchronization and we're doing LDAP authentication. In our next task, we're going to actually modify object attributes on the LDAP server. There may be a case where it ends up that you do have to modify or change object attributes in LDAP, and that will allow us to modify variables that are tied to the users, we can modify that information in our Active Directory server because that's acting as our LDAP server. So let's go to our remote desktop here. Let's see, we don't have a remote desktop icon. Doesn't look like it. So let's just do remote desktop here. And connect to our server. All right, so 10.1.5.100. Authenticate. Yes. All right. And we're going to go ahead and go to our Active Directory users and computers. And in this case, we're going to modify J Doe. So let's go to John Doe. And we're going to modify the properties of John Doe. Let me scroll down here a little bit. We're going to modify the properties of John Doe. Still can't see it. There we go. Properties. And these are kind of all the attributes that are tied to this particular user. All right. Now, I could come in here and I could say, okay, I want to go ahead and rename this user, and I can specify John Doe. We're going to actually go ahead and change this user and change it to, let's do Joe Green in this particular case. And we're going to change this from Joe Green to Joe Brown. Let me see. Let's rename. Let's just go to properties. And we're going to change this to Joe Brown. All right. So Brown here. All right. And the display name needs to be Joe Brown. All right. Not Boren. I don't know where that came from. Interesting. All right, so we're going to rename this guy to Joe Brown. The user login name should be J Brown. And that should change to J Brown. For some reason, I cannot type today. All right, J Brown and J Brown. All right. We're going to save that information. And then we're going to go back to our call manager. So we'll save that information. Let's go ahead and rename it here as well so we're not confused. Joe Brown. All right. That all looks good. Okay. All right. So let's go back to our call manager now. We'll minimize our remote desktop connection here and go back to our call manager. And hopefully what we'll see from this change is if we go back to our LDAP directory, all right, we select the directory that we've created, LDAP server, and we do our full resync, we should see that information populated in call manager relatively quickly. Let's go back to my end user, and there's Joe Brown, all right, as opposed to Joe Green. Now, we can also apply filters to the synchronization of Active Directory. When we're synchronizing and synchronizing is enabled for the first time on the call manager publisher server, accounts that exist in the corporate directory get imported into the call manager database. Call manager end user accounts get activated, the data gets updated, or even a new user account gets created. And there's basically a process that we're going to follow, right? The first thing is that a synchronization initialization. So all pre-existing accounts are going to be marked as inactive. During the synchronization initialization as well, accounts from the LDAP database that match a Cisco call manager account are going to be marked as active. And then after the synchronization, any inactive LDAP synchronized accounts are going to be permanently deleted. We talked about this in the lecture portion of the course, right? After that synchronization is complete, any accounts that were not set to active that get permanently deleted are going to be processed through the garbage collection process that garbage collection process is a process that runs at a fixed time at 3:15 a.m. And we can't configure that. So when the changes are made in the corporate directory, the synchronization from Microsoft Active Directory occurs as a full resynchronization at the next scheduled period. All right. Other directories, we will kind of do incremental synchronization. So if you're making changes on the fly in the middle of the day, those changes will not be populated to Call Manager either unless you do a manual resynchronization or you go through the full synchronization process. In an Active Directory deployment, the object GUID or GUID is used internally within Call Manager as the key attribute of that particular user. The attribute in Active Directory that corresponds to the Call Manager user ID is something that we can actually change in Active Directory. We saw that when we were setting up the synchronization agreement. If the SAM account name is being used, the user can change their SAM account name in Active Directory, and then that corresponding user record is going to get populated and updated in Call Manager. If we have other LDAP platforms, the attribute that is mapped to the user ID is the key for that account in Call Manager. So changing that attribute in LDAP will result in a new user being created in Call Manager, and the original user will end up being marked as inactive. So in our next step, we're going to go into user management, and we're going to go into our end users. We already see Joe Green is listed here. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and convert this user to a local user. All right, so user information that's actually synchronized from the LDAP directory can be converted to local user information, so then we can then edit that information locally within Call Manager. Local end users can actually be added manually using the Call Manager option, but during an LDAP synchronization, not sure what happened there. That's weird. Sorry, I had to start this section over because my lab reset. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and convert this LDAP synchronized user to a local user. All that information then is going to be managed from that user itself. So let's go to J Doe in this particular case. And we're going to go ahead and go to the bottom of our user configuration page. Well, let's refresh that one more time. Not sure why it's not displaying the information correctly. But we have a button here that says go ahead and convert this user to an LDAP, from that LDAP synchronized user to the local user. All right, and this just gives us the ability to kind of manage this user within Call Manager environment. We would probably do this if we want to manage the most important users that we have in the system from Call Manager and not rely on Active Directory for that user itself. So now we can see the status has gone from LDAP synchronized user to a enabled local user, and we can see that listed here as well. All right, this account's supposed to be gone. When I refreshed the lab, it showed up again. But anyway, this is the J Doe has now been converted to a local user. All right, now when we're doing our synchronization with Active Directory, the Active Directory forest, and it contains multiple trees, multiple synchronization agreements will be needed for the same reason that we had talked about previously. Also, Active Directory guarantees that the user principal name attribute is unique across the entire forest, and so we have to choose that as the attribute that's going to get mapped over to the Call Manager user ID. We're going to change the LDAP attribute in this task for the user ID from SAM account name to user principal name. We would do that obviously in a production environment where we do have multiple replications or agreements that we're establishing as part of the configuration. So if Microsoft Active Directory Forest, like I said, has multiple trees, we would go ahead and do this. Because we have a single LDAP search space, and in this case, that single LDAP search space cannot cover multiple namespaces, Call Manager has to use an alternative mechanism to authenticate users across discontiguous namespaces. So in this task, we're going to change the LDAP attribute for the user ID to user principal name. We're going to perform the synchronization, and we'll take a look at the difference in the end user configuration page. So we're going to go to System LDAP. We're going to go over to our LDAP directory. We'll find the synchronization agreement that we've configured, and we're going to delete this synchronization agreement. All right. It's going to give us a warning. And then we're going to go ahead and add a new synchronization agreement. Actually, let's go ahead and go to our LDAP system first. LDAP and LDAP system. All right. And we're going to change the attribute from SAM account name to user principal name in this particular case. All right. Now we're going to go back to our directory. We're going to create a new synchronization agreement. All right. We don't have any more listed. And we're going to go ahead and configure this. We'll call this LDAP server like we did in the past. Administrator at cll-collab.internal. The password is still the same, C0LL@B. The search space is still going to be CN equals users, comma, DC equals CLL-collab, comma, DC equals internal. All right. And we're going to still do 6 hours in this case. We'll scroll down. We need to add the access control group, standard CCM end user. So we'll add that selected. And then our host, oops, not history, Control F, host, IP, host. And we're going to specify the host address that we're going to use as our Active Directory server. So 10.1.5.100 for Active Directory. So we'll go ahead and save that. All right. Wrong LDAP search space. Oh, CN equals users. I don't know why I put user. All right. CLL-collab internal. Okay, go ahead and save that. That's kind of interesting, right? Because it did actually go out and check to see if that was an actual valid search space. So let's go ahead and do a full sync. All right. And now if I go to my user management and I go to my end users, we can see outside of that local user that we had enabled, we can see all the other users' user IDs are based on that primary ID that we specified as the way to identify the user principal name, excuse me, as the way to identify that individual user. Okay. All right. Our next task is going to be troubleshooting LDAP integration. Different LDAP integration issues can come up. Maybe it's a server misconfiguration. Maybe the authentication parameters that we've set up are wrong, or the LDAP search space is misconfigured. So we're going to troubleshoot problems that happen between our call manager and the LDAP server. In this particular case, we're going to configure a typical LDAP mistake by using the wrong LDAP user search space parameters, and then we're going to use RTMT to analyze the directory sync traces before the issue starts. So the first thing we have to do is delete the configured LDAP directory, and then we're going to configure a new LDAP directory with those incorrect parameters, and then we're going to use the directory sync service traces, excuse me, in RTMT to see those particular errors. All right. And we're also going to verify all the different synchronization in this particular case. So first, let's start by kind of just logging into the real-time monitoring tool. We already have that set up here on the desktop. We're going to connect to our publisher. We'll authenticate using our standard CCM user account. And let that load up. All right. Oops. Did I not type it correctly? Pub. Okay. Administrator. All right. All right, when we go into our Trace and Log Central, we're going to get this warning for IMMP. We'll just go ahead and bypass that. And then we're going to go collect our trace files. And the trace files we're specifically looking for are on our Call Manager Publisher. And we are specifically looking for the trace files for directory sync. So we don't see it listed on this page. There is actually another page that contains additional options. And here's our directory sync. We want to go ahead and enable that on our publisher. We'll go ahead and click Finish. It'll take a little bit of time to collect that information. We'll go ahead and click Nodes on our publisher. We should see that information populate. We'll go ahead and run this down, go to System, go to Cisco Directory Sync, look at the log file. We're going to see the files that are contained within this log file. And we're going to look at the directory sync one, not the error log, but this log here. We'll use our generic viewer to view the log, and that will open up in our log application. All right. Now this is a bunch of information that we've collected from the system that indicates all of the the steps and the tasks that were completed for the directory sync. We can certainly look for all kinds of information within these logs, but our goal is really just to kind of collect the information that we're looking for. Let's say, for example, we're looking for successfully completed the full sync. All right, that would be an example of a message that would be displayed if the synchronization was completed successfully. And as I scroll down here, I should see it highlighted if I spelled it correctly. We should see it highlighted. There it goes. We ran the collection at 4:35 on 1/11/2021, and we successfully completed the full sync. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our call manager, and we're going to misconfigure the configuration, and then we're going to do our troubleshooting from that perspective. So let's go back to our call manager administration page. We're going to find our LDAP server, which we have already in this page, and we're going to actually delete that LDAP server configuration. So we'll say delete selected, and then we're going to create a new LDAP entry. Let's say LDAP server. The distinguished name is administrator at cll-collab.internal. And did I spell that right? Administrator, yep. C0LL at B. C0LL at B. And we're going to specify the search space as CN equals user, not users. And DC equals CLL-collab. And DC equals local. All right. We'll still do all the other parameters the same, 6 hours there. We're going to map over a telephone number to IP phone. We're going to map over directory URI to mail. And then we'll come down here and we'll specify the user group that we're going to join the users to in this particular case, which is not read-only, CCM end users. All right, we'll save that configuration. And then also we're going to come down and add the server. All right, and in this case we'll make the server correct. So only the search space is incorrect in this particular example. Save that configuration and let's go ahead and perform the sync. All right, now if I come up here and I do my perform the full sync, it's going to go through the process of performing the sync, and what we should see based on this is users are no longer found. The search space is accurate. We do actually have a group within our domain called user. Otherwise, it would just simply report that those users are not there or that search space is incorrect. But we actually may not have that search space available, but we can now see that all the users are marked as inactive. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and go back to our RTMT tool and go back to our server, and we will go ahead and do a refresh all. We could do a browse here also. All right. That's fine, no problem. Let's go ahead and collect our traces again. We could have done a refresh, I guess, but I just went ahead and did the trace all over again. It's not running on all nodes, but let's run it on the publisher. And click Finish. And we'll run that synchronization. All right. So we're basically going to look for the log4j file. We're going to take a look at the error log. It's going to be the file that is essentially the file that is the top one in the list is going to be the last one that was collected. So we should see an additional file now in this particular case. And I'll just click on this. We're going to use the generic viewer. I hit OK. And now what we're looking for is kind of any error that might show up in this particular list. Now, obviously, there could be lots of reasons why an error might occur, but in our particular case, we know why, because of the search space that we specified. So if I go ahead and search for error, you can see there are many, many different places where errors are indicated, and specifically we can see that I'm trying to see if we see anything specific to the error code, and I think it's going to be a little bit lower down. Let's take a look here. I'm looking specifically for what references the search space that we specified right here, right? So we're referencing error code 10, referencing cll-collab.local, the name cn user dc cll-collab, and then it's kind of cryptic, right? We have to be able to identify what these codes represent, but the search space should be users, not user. So that's something that we might be able to identify. Of course, you could also go through the configuration and kind of just double check and verify the configuration. So this is kind of a simple, but it is a very common problem that we see with LDAP synchronization, this configuration. All right. So that wraps up this discovery. It also wraps up this module. We're going to do our summary challenge, and then we'll get into our next module, which is implementing Cisco Unified Communications Manager provisioning features. All right, so we'll see you guys there. All right, so let's wrap up this module by talking about going through our summary challenge. Which two options are supported in LDAP integration options? We can do synchronization if we so choose, and we can also do authentication. And we can do them independently as well, although we would probably never run authentication without synchronization. We certainly will see scenarios where we would run synchronization without authentication, although it's kind of uncommon anyway. If you're going to do any kind of LDAP integration, you're pretty much going to do both. At 8 a.m. on January 1st, an account is disabled or deleted in Active Directory, and the periodic resynchronization is scheduled for 11 p.m. What is the state of the account at 3:15 a.m.? So the account won't get deleted because we have to wait 24 hours for the garbage collector. The account, we did pass the 11 p.m. synchronization, so the account will actually be marked as inactive. There is no state, no such state as idle in the case of LDAP. You either have deleted, active, or inactive. Deleted would be an account that was removed based on the garbage collector running. How does Cisco Unified Communications Manager with LDAP authentication configured interact with an end user when the user tries to enter credentials to log into this self-care portal? Now, that particular configuration does, even though it is an application, ties to the end user. And end user authentication is always going to be based on credentials that are stored in the LDAP server if we have LDAP authentication enabled. All right, so the answer in this case is Cisco Unified Communications Manager forwards the user credentials to the LDAP server to authenticate that particular user. When configuring LDAP synchronization with Active Directory attributes, which Active Directory attributes, can be mapped to call manager first name. The only thing that can be mapped to the call manager first name is the given name in this particular case. All right, well, that's the only one in the list anyway. All right, how many user search bases are needed if you have one root and two child Active Directory domains? You have to have 3. We have to have one for the root and one for each of the child domains. What are the 2 types of privileges that can be assigned to a resource in a role configuration? We can do read and we can do update. All right, and then we can also have no access, which isn't one of the choices here. Update would be basically considered to be a write, but we don't call it a write, we call it an update. Which 2 conditions apply when configuring automatic line creation? Feature group templates are assigned in the directory synchronization agreement. That is correct. Remember, that's that top level reference, which goes to the service profile and the user profile, which then in turn look at the services or the universal line template or the universal device template. All right, a universal device template is chosen in the user profile, which is chosen in the feature group template. That is not correct. Universal line templates are chosen in the user profile, which is chosen in the feature group template. That's actually the correct answer here. And the other answers are not correct. All right, so we'll go ahead and wrap up this module. We'll see you guys in the next module. In the next module, we'll be talking about implementing call manager provisioning features. All right, so we'll see you there.